Is there really a God, or is religion just a myth? This is one of the biggest questions humanity has ever asked. And today, we're going to answer it once and for all in under 6 minutes. What do you think? Is there a God or not? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. Hey everyone, welcome to Atheism's Biggest Questions Answered. Today, we're answering the question, is God real or just a myth? If you're new here, make sure to subscribe so you never miss an upload. In order to answer this question, we need to first define our terms. So let's begin with the definition of the word God. In philosophy and theology, God is defined as a supernatural being, often considered to be the creator and ruler of the universe. Now, there are many different definitions of what exactly constitutes a God, but for the sake of simplicity, we're just going to roll with this one. Now that we have a basic understanding of what we mean when we say God, we can move on to answering the question, is God real or just a myth? To answer this question, we will be breaking down the various arguments for and against the existence of God. We will then evaluate the validity of these arguments and ultimately come to a conclusion as to whether or not there is enough evidence to support the claim that God is real. One of the most common arguments used to support the existence of God is the cosmological argument. The cosmological argument for the existence of God basically says that everything must have a cause and that the ultimate cause of all things is God. For example, the Big Bang could not have happened by itself. Something must have caused it to happen. That something is God. However, this argument is not without its flaws. First, it does not explain how God came to be. If everything needs a cause, then God needs a cause as well. Second, it does not explain why God would create the universe. There could be any number of reasons why God decided to create the universe, but the cosmological argument doesn't provide us with any insight as to why that may be. Finally, the cosmological argument is based on the assumption that the universe did indeed have a beginning. However, modern science tells us that the universe may be infinite in its duration. If that's the case, then the cosmological argument falls apart entirely. As we see it, the cosmological argument is not a very strong argument for the existence of God. It does not provide a very convincing explanation as to why God would create the universe, nor does it explain how God came to be. Another common argument used to support the existence of God is the teleological argument. The teleological argument, also known as the argument from design, basically says that the universe is so complex and finely tuned that it must have been created by an intelligent being. For example, the laws of physics are so precise that if they were even slightly different, life as we know it would not be possible. This suggests that there must be an intelligent being who created the universe in such a way that life could flourish. However, this argument is also not without its flaws. First, it assumes that the universe had a beginning. As we already discussed, modern science tells us that the universe may be infinite in its duration. If that's the case, then the teleological argument falls apart. Second, the teleological argument assumes that the universe was created for a purpose. However, there is no reason to believe that that must necessarily be the case. Finally, the teleological argument assumes that an intelligent being is necessary to create the universe in such a way that life could flourish. However, there is no reason to believe that that must necessarily be the case. There are a number of scientific theories that attempt to explain the origin of the universe without the need for an intelligent creator. Therefore, the teleological argument is not a very strong argument for the existence of God. The next argument we will consider is the moral argument. The moral argument for the existence of God basically says that objective morality exists, and that means that there must be a God who is the source of that morality. For example, if God does not exist, then there is no ultimate standard by which we can judge right and wrong. Everything would be permissible. However, this argument is not without its flaws. First, it assumes that objective morality exists. However, there is no reason to believe that that must necessarily be the case. Many philosophers argue that morality is nothing more than a set of subjective opinions. Second, even if objective morality did exist, it does not necessarily follow that God is the source of that morality. There could be any number of reasons why God would create the universe, but the moral argument doesn't provide us with any insight as to why that may be. Finally, the moral argument assumes that an all-knowing, all-powerful, all-good God would create a world full of evil and suffering. However, there is no reason to believe that that must necessarily be the case. Some philosophers argue that evil and suffering are simply the result of human free will. Therefore, the moral argument is not a very strong argument for the existence of God. Finally, we will consider the personal experience argument. The personal experience argument for the existence of God basically says that people have religious experiences that provide evidence for the existence of God. For example, many people claim to have seen or heard God. However, this argument is not without its flaws. First, religious experiences are highly subjective and cannot be verified by empirical evidence. Second, even if religious experiences were empirical evidence, they would not prove that God exists. At best, they would prove that the person having the experience is God, but that doesn't prove anything about the existence of a God outside of that person. Finally, the personal experience argument is based on the assumption that people are never mistaken about their religious experiences. However, there are many cases of people being mistaken about their religious experiences. For example, people who have had near-death experiences often report seeing a bright light at the end of a tunnel. However, when they are brought back from the dead, they often find that there was no light at the end of the tunnel. Therefore, the personal experience argument is not a very strong argument for the existence of God. After carefully considering all of these arguments, we have come to the conclusion that there is not enough evidence to support the claim that God is real. While there are many arguments that have been used throughout history to try and prove the existence of God, none of them are ultimately convincing. The cosmological argument, teleological argument, moral argument, and personal experience argument all have their flaws. Ultimately, the question of whether or not God exists is a matter of faith. There is no empirical evidence that can prove or disprove the existence of God. Therefore, we must each decide for ourselves whether or not we believe in God. But what about those people who claim to have religious experiences? Are we just supposed to ignore them? Well, it's up to you to decide what you believe. We personally think that religious experiences are highly subjective and cannot be verified by empirical evidence. However, we respect the fact that other people may disagree with us. So, what about the argument from design? Isn't it just too much of a coincidence that the universe is so perfectly suited for life? Well, we actually think that the argument from design is the strongest argument for the existence of God. However, we still don't think it's enough to prove God's existence. Why? Because there are a number of scientific theories that attempt to explain the origin of the universe without the need for an intelligent creator. For example, the theory of everything would suggest that the universe came into being due to quantum fluctuations in a pre-existing void. This is just one example. There are many others. Ultimately, the question of whether or not God exists is a mystery that may never be solved. However, we think that the lack of evidence for God's existence is actually a good thing. Why? Because it means that we have the freedom to choose what we believe. If there was clear evidence for God's existence, then we wouldn't have the freedom to choose what we believe. We would all be forced to believe in God, but because there is no clear evidence for God's existence, we are free to choose what we want to believe. We think that this is a good thing because it allows us to use our reason to decide what we believe. We want to make it clear that we respect people's right to believe in God. We all have the freedom to choose what we want to believe. However, we think that it is important to be honest about the lack of evidence for God's existence. If we pretend that there is evidence for God's existence when there isn't, then we are doing a disservice to ourselves and to others. We should all be able to make an informed decision about what we believe based on the evidence. That being said, we also want to make it clear that we are not trying to convert anyone to atheism. We are simply trying to answer the question, is God real or just a myth? We hope that you have found this video helpful and that it has helped you to better understand the different arguments for and against the existence of God. If you have any questions or comments, please feel free to leave them below. We would love to hear from you. Thank you for watching. Make sure to subscribe so you never miss an upload.